Yeah, well, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks Dr. DeBarros for that great talk earlier.
We're glad to have you.
Yeah, if I'm allowed to make a confession, before I went to college, I didn't believe in an Earth older than 10,000 years or so, given the religious instruction from my family. So, you all will.
I'll ask you whether you changed your mind.
Yeah, you'll be able to tell, I think. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you all about how I'm interested in researching the process of evolution, particularly how it pertains to cooperation in this particular small-scale tribal society in the Amazon. Okay, so I'm going to go over a little bit about what cooperation is and why we're interested in it generally. So you can see here that there's literature, expounding upon how important it is to explain cooperation from a biological and social sciences view. A quick definition you could use is just it's collective action for mutual benefit. So when, for example, you and some other person, you want to do something you can't do alone, like build a school, you can't do that by yourself, but together you can, and then you achieve something you couldn't do alone. But I'll go into why this is a problem, because you open yourself up to being taken advantage of by free riders. So those are individuals who aren't investing in the collective action as much as you are, but they're still kind of receiving the benefits of what it delivers to people. And this is especially a problem as group size increases. So I'm going to more explicitly define this problem using some game theory. So yeah, what's the problem with cooperation? So one really easy way to look at this is with the prisoner's dilemma, which, as these researchers say, it models the fundamental conflict inherent in social living. It's the conflict between individual and collective interests. So this is going to explicitly sort of define what are the incentives to cooperate and what are our incentives to defect on cooperation. So this is a way you can look at a prisoner's dilemma. There's two players or two people interacting with each other. That's what you see when it says the row player and the column player. They each have a decision to make, and that's whether to cooperate or to defect. And then whatever decision they make is actually interacts with the decision of the other player, and it leads to some sort of payoff for the both of them. So the game is defined by the payoff structure as it says up there. I'll just kind of go through this real quick. So if the row player cooperates and the column player cooperates, you achieve the reward for cooperation, which is, you build the school, everyone's sort of happy, and you can kind of just, that number 3 isn't really connected to something specific, but it's just illustrating the point. So let's say we're the row player again, and we're cooperating just as we were, but this time the column player defects on the cooperation. So in this instance, we would receive that payoff that's S. We don't get anything. And the defector would get everything because they save on the investment that they defect on, but they still get the payoff. And then if both individuals end up defecting, it's actually better off than being a cooperator taken advantage of by a defector. So the payoff structure T greater than R greater than P greater than S just illustrates that the individual greatest thing you can do is cheat on someone while they're trying to cooperate with you. The second best is actually cooperating with someone else who wants to cooperate with you. The third worst thing that could happen is you just defect with another defector because you're not really being taken advantage of, but you're not achieving any higher cooperation. And then the worst thing you can do is be that unlucky individual who's being cheated on or defected upon. So given these outcomes, it's thought that universal defection would be the result, because no other strategy you can implement can get you to that higher payoff. If you're both defecting, switching to cooperation leads to a lower payoff. So that's why defection is considered the Nash equilibrium. Once you're at this point, you can't move away without changing the other player's payoff. Okay. Yeah, this kind of just reillustrates that group payoff is maximized by full cooperation, but the individual payoff is maximized by full defection. So that's that inherent conflict of collective and individual interests that I mentioned. Yeah, so I mentioned Nash equilibrium. A term you may be more familiar with is an evolutionary stable strategy. So that is a behavior, once it's dominant in a group or population, it cannot be invaded by any sort of alternative strategy. So if you're thinking about a population of defectors and you have one brave cooperator walk in, he or she is not going to gain any traction because it's only running into defectors. You're getting that lowest possible payoff again. And conversely, if you're a full population of cooperators, one defector can come in and start undermining cooperation in the whole group. So that's the problem of cooperation. Yeah, so where does this leave us? This is such a problem. So I really like how Steven Pinker puts it, and y'all may be familiar. He's quite a popular scientist, but he says the megalomania of the genes does not mean that benevolence and cooperation cannot evolve any more than the law of gravity proves that flight can't evolve. It only means that benevolence or cooperation, like flight, is a special state of affairs. We just need an explanation of how to get there. It's not just something we would expect to happen. So there's actually a lot of theories and derived hypotheses about what can incentivize cooperation over defection. So I'm going to kind of go over the first two, kin selection and reciprocal altruism. The other ones are just, for example, there's lots of them. So for instance, kin selection, this is kind of a foundational thing here. So it sort of explains how you can act cooperatively towards another individual, and if they're related to you, you're still being benefited, because actually the genes in your body, if you're related to someone else, you share a certain portion of those genes with them. So if you think about your parents or any of your siblings, you actually share 50% of the exact same genes and DNA. So even if you're thinking about selfish genes, which is probably a term you've heard, you can have genes be selfish, but due to the fact that there's exact replicas of them in relatives, they can instigate behavior that benefits the individual that's also carrying those same genes. And so there's like a real simple kind of formula here. And so B is benefit and C is cost. So we're always thinking about benefits and costs. And then that term R is just the degree to which someone's related. So if the benefit times the relatedness, or discounting the relatedness, is greater than the cost, you can still have cooperation or altruistic acts towards this individual. And it explains why you'd be more cooperative to individuals more closely related to you. Okay. And then reciprocal altruism from Trivers. So this goes on to explain why you can see cooperation and altruism towards individuals that aren't related to you at all. In that if you engage altruistically with someone and there's an expectation that that other individual will act in a similar manner, be altruistic back to you sometime in the future, and if that expectation is met, then you can have cooperation in that way. So if you maybe heard tit for tat, it's you do something good for someone else, and then they do it to you, you kind of have confidence that you can keep that going, and that's something that can sustain cooperation. So this sort of simple mathematical expression here is Very similar to the other one, it's just you're replacing that R value with this W, which is just the likelihood of interacting and getting that future benefit. Okay, so that's all sort of theoretical, but let's move into human cooperation. So all societies exhibit varied and very complex cooperative behaviors, as Dr. DeBarros said. So some broad categories could be in resource sharing, which is something I'll cover actually. Coordinated production, so that could be building a school for the community. I had a mentor at Texas A&M. He studied these whale hunters in Indonesia, and that was coordinated resource production. Aid giving, and then coalitionally based conflict. So that's why even in instances of warfare, which we usually think of as a breakdown of cooperation, there's actually lots of cooperation involved with all the individuals that happen to be on your side of a conflict against some other coalition. So that's. And then moving into more like complex societies, we're even seeing that humans cooperate in like extremely large groups with unrelated strangers in many contexts, which is, adding on even to that mystery of cooperation now that we're living in bigger groups than we ever had in our evolutionary history, and we're still cooperating with all these strangers that we never meet again. But that's not too much the focus of this talk. Okay, so. This begins a section where I'm going to go over the select research cases of cooperation in this one field site. So my advisor, Dr. John Patton, works in this community called Canambo, Ecuador. He's been working there for over 20 years now. So I went with him this summer, and I was collecting data for my master's thesis research, which isn't included in this, but I'm going over research he's done. So some things about the physical environment is the community lies on the banks of the Canambo River. This is 200 kilometers east of the Andes. This region is the upper Amazon. It's a tropical rainforest environment, as you can see. And annually, they experience about 10 meters of rain a year, which is a lot. That will keep you from flying out of there on the airstrip for a few days because it will rain and delay you. But that's due to a major rain shadow effect. You have weather systems moving east to west across the Amazon. It hits the Andes and drops all this rain here. So that's actually why during the Pleistocene, there's all these ice ages where the Amazon would recede and then expand as the caps melted and released more moisture, but this area was always a continuously wet pocket because of that rain shadow effect. And it just led to it's one of the highest biodiversity hot spots on the planet, but I just think that's interesting to know. But I'll move into some of the ethnographic context here. So Canambo is a horticultural foraging tribal community of Achuar and Quechua peoples in the Amazon. So unlike other places, there's two ethnic groups or two indigenous tribes living on this one community. There's an airstrip that's parallel to the river, and yeah, you'll see that the community is completely segregated by these political alliances. They exhibit matrilocal postmarital residence. So that means men actually leave their natal communities to go find wives and establish themselves, when they're ready to marry and start their own family. But females or women stay in their community and have other men come in, which is sort of an interesting thing because that's not how communities in the evolutionary past were mostly thought to have worked. But it's an interesting detail of this area. So people live in single households with no line of sight between them. They practice slash and burn horticulture. You can kind of see that in the lower picture. That's kind of an empty field. They're kind of starting to replant that there. They practice usufruct-based land tenure systems, so there's not really extreme territoriality that's inherited. It's just I build my garden here and now I use it. Is all that's referring to really. There's no roads or markets going in, so you have to get in a small propeller plane and fly about an hour east into the jungle. They drop you off, and then it takes off, and then you're sort of there. There's no markets, so if you need something, you have to get it from someone or know how to get it yourself. And the people are economically self-sufficient. Okay. Some more, they're politically egalitarian, so there's no headmen or formal leadership positions. Leadership that is, observed there is situational, and it's voluntarily heeded. The individuals there are well nourished. They're eating a ton of protein. Like I mentioned, it's a very rich region, so they have lots of access to hunted meat. Both Achuar and Quechua target the same prey species. They hunt them in the same way. They use these blowguns with poison darts or 28-gauge shotguns. They're actually reverting back to blowguns since the Ecuadorian government's starting to tax all these shotgun shells a lot more, so it's kind of shifting back to an older way of hunting. Let's see, okay, this is the important part here. The Achuar-Quechua ethnic boundary represents a salient and volatile coalitional divide. Community alliances have been characterized as shifting, cross-cutting, and consequential. Several accounts agree on a recent male homicide rate of roughly 50%. So that's one of the highest homicide rates ever calculated on the planet. So I think the highest is of the Guarani, and that's just the group that's in like the region just north of here. This isn't something that's continuing on to the present moment, but within the living memory of some of the older generations, there was all these head-taking raids. If you ever saw anything about people or these tribes killing people and shrinking their heads for trophies, that's where this, it was in this area where this sort of practice occurred. Okay, so this really illustrates this political divide here. So all the Achuar households are colored red and the Quechua ones are colored blue. And so that lines the Canambo River. The airstrip sort of runs parallel, so the Achuar are living upriver and the Quechua are downriver. And some of the ways we study, or some of the realms of cooperation that my advisor studied in Canambo, and I'm going to tell you about, is in coalitional aggression. Another one is in experimental economic games. And then the last one is going to be in food sharing. So I'm going to jump into coalitional aggression. So why do people risk their lives in warfare? I'm going to define warfare, briefly as just intercoalitional violence, and if we need a sub-definition of coalition, think of it as a group of two or more allied individuals that are coordinating or cooperating with each other to achieve some sort of goal. So if we think of it that way, it's two or more allied individuals coordinating to either coordinate security against another group of individuals or inflict harm upon another group of individuals. So participating in warfare, it's individually costly, and when it's successful, it benefits other people in your coalition. So it kind of has that same individual collective conflict of interests as that was exhibited earlier in the cooperation. So specifically, some of the costs is that it's individually risky and for injury and dying, in fact. Something that increases the risk of not just on yourself, but even your whole community is that usually this starts like a cycle of revenge raids that's a lot more deadly than whatever like the initial event that's starting violent conflict is, because people just keep, hitting each other back and forth. Some of the benefits are that you get greater access to territory and resources, more mates and mating opportunities, and overall more group security and defense. And these benefits are of such a nature that you can't really exclude like any one individual from, benefiting from greater group security. It's impractical, so it presents individuals with that incentive to free ride in this, coalitional aggression. So I'm going to use the Yanomamo example. Maybe some of y'all heard of this. It's usually covered in anthro stuff. So they live in the Venezuelan Amazon, as you can see in this image right on that Brazilian-Venezuelan border. And they live in these big kind of like circular houses, like the whole community together. So that's something that's different from how Kanamba works. So some more information. Yeah, so there's a history of between community raid and warfare in these communities. Men who successfully kill an enemy on a raid subsequently undergo a ritual, and that's done to protect them from like the spirit of the person they just killed, but it bestows them with this socially recognized status as an unukai is what it's called. So if you're looking at unukai and you're comparing them to non-unukai individuals, the unukai possess 2.5 times the number of wives and 3 times as many offspring. So that's sort of disconcerting, but that's the data. And I guess I can sort of like explain like how a raid actually works. So what the Yanomamo do is they'll organize a raiding group, the night before, and well, depending on how far away the village they want to go to is, they leave out. So they're right at, right before the crack of dawn, and whenever the first person to walk out of the Shabono, which is what that big circular village is called, they just launch all their spears and hit whoever walks out, and then they, hightail it back as fast as they can. Okay, so Chagnon's the name of the anthropologist that was studying the Yanomamo and this coalitional warfare. So he interpreted this correlation as part of a general process where culturally defined success, such as achieving this unukai status, leads to biological success. So if you do something that your society values, then you will possess social status for doing it. Undoubtedly, coalitional violence is incredibly important for the Yanomamo. Not that they're inherently violent or anything, but even just the threat of other groups potentially attacking you can instigate you to do that to other communities, so you're not drawing all the aggression and attention on yourself because others know that your community is weak and won't retaliate. So the unukai distinction is a status signifier, and it's been observed sort of all over that status is an incredibly important factor in influencing reproductive success. So now we're switching back to Kanambo, and this flows right out of this because Pat and my advisor, Chagnon, was his advisor, and he was actually on his way to do dissertation research with the Yanomamo when Venezuela had a coup. So he had to completely switch countries that he was working in and decided to go to Ecuador and continue on there. So this is drawing from one book chapter he had published with a research question of why do warriors undertake the somatically risky behaviors associated with war when the benefits derived from the risk they take appear to be a public good, that is group defense and the pursuit of coalitional goals. So I mentioned kin selection earlier, and that is usually and often invoked to explain warfare in human evolutionary history. As I mentioned, in our evolutionary history, most groups were thought to be patrilocal. So that's having male individuals stay in the community they're born in, so they're more related to the other male individuals who are the ones they would be acting coalitionally against another group. But that's not the case in Kanambo. It's matrilocal. Men aren't that closely related. So kin selection does not seem like that great of a fit to explain this situation. So that moves us along to kin reciprocity. Is that characterizing the relations between warriors and the coalitional members? Okay, so status is basically what we're going to be looking at if that's what's reciprocated for risk that's taken on in warfare. So in egalitarian societies, social status is achieved. It's not a product of inheritance, like being born into a certain class or caste, or being ascribed because you're born to a certain lineage. Social status is a social reward and a zero-sum game. So the more social status one individual achieves, it actually comes at the detriment of lower social status of another individual. So if warriors are given status in proportion to the risks that they're taking for the group benefit, then this would indicate an evolved strategy for the coalitionally appropriate use of violence for status gain. So I'm going to go into the data to show how that shows this. So first, how we get the data. So I'm talking about warriorship, who's like a better warrior, who has more status. So a really easy way to do this is we take like identification photographs of all the willing participants in the community. So we have their little pictures, and then so we have this participant here on the left, and we ask him to just place these photographs, in like separate tiers of who has more status and who has lower status. So they can make as many tiers as they want and put as many individuals on the same tier as they want, which indicates like a relatively equal amount of whatever the criteria is they're using to rank them. And then you can scale this between 1 and 0, with like the top tier being 1 and 0. So all the other ones are receive a value like relatively in between that. So that's how you get individual measurements for someone's status and warriorship, because you get everyone to do this, then you average those. Okay. We also calculate alliance strengths in the community. So this is also using these ID photos. If you're we start at the top there, so we like throw all the men's photos together, or women's, because you can do this with women too. But you throw all the men's photos together in one big group, and you say, there's a hypothetical conflict in the community, and this group splits up, these guys with these guys, and these guys with these guys, like which individuals would like go with each other. And so then you allow them to start moving these photographs out of the big group and to make 2 separate groups. You ask them, okay, out of these groups, if there's a conflict, which group splits the easiest, and then which individuals fall into those respective groups. And you keep doing that. And then the individuals that are next to each other after all these splitting events have occurred, you can give them that's indicative of greater strengths of alliance relationships, because they survived all these splitting events. Okay, so this gets into the actual correlations and things. So looking at the data, it was found that better warriors have proportionally more social status than lesser warriors. So I don't know how familiar y'all are with statistics, but that is quite a strong correlation. So that's from data collected in 1993, and then subsequently this was redone in 1998, and it was even stronger correlation with that data set. So okay, yeah, so we just saw that warriorship is correlated with men's status. Something else is that status is correlated with reproductive success, and warriorship is correlated not directly with reproductive success, but things that are important to achieving greater reproductive success. So, achieving, fatherhood for the first time at like a younger age, and being seen as a better son-in-law, which is an important thing in a matrilocal community, because you're from an outside community moving in. That son-in-law, father-in-law relationship with your wife's father is incredibly important. Okay, so as I kind of briefly went over with the reciprocal altruism and that W value, which I mentioned is like the likelihood of being reciprocated in the future, in this context, we should think of that W value as like the likelihood of receiving coalitional support in the future. So that's why we're using these alliance relationships to sort of be like a proxy for that. So stronger alliance relationships indicate that you're more likely to receive support from that individual in any sort of coalitional action you may take. And that's indicated by this data. So you can see alliance strength on this x-axis here, and as alliance strength increases between two individuals, that leads to a greater likelihood of biasing them with greater status. So that kind of exactly fits with what you would expect. You don't want to give status to someone who you wouldn't expect to reciprocate it back with that, with alliance and support in coalitional activities. So I really like these because these like severely indicate the degree of in-group status bias between Achuar and Quechua informants. So the Achuar informants, you can see that's what they rank their own men and the Quechua outgroup men in terms of status. So they give their own men like, an amount way greater than average in status, and then the outgroup men an amount way lower than average. And conversely, the Quechua do that also. They give themselves more status than they give the Achuar. What's really interesting here is if you look at the warriorship data, that it's not biased towards the in-group that exact same way. So the Achuar, you ask them, they're like, yeah, we're the better warriors, as indicated by ranking Achuar men higher in those tiers than Quechua men. And the Quechua men do the same thing. They're like, yeah, they're warriors, more than us. So what are the conclusions from this? So the conclusion should be that the Yanomamo Unukai reproductive success correlation isn't just an anomaly. The original finding is substantiated by another case, and since then more and more other cases. There's an in-group bias for awarding status to warriors, and as I mentioned prior, if warriors are given status in proportion to the risk they're taking on for the group benefit, then it indicates an evolved strategy for the coalitionally appropriate use of violence for status gain. And then I think the coalitionally appropriate use is like one of the key terms there. So that's like if I revert back to the Yanomamo for a second, these Unukai, they're not considered like murderers or random killers. They're the Yanomamo equivalent of war heroes, basically. Okay, I'm going to switch over into talking about cooperation in economic games. So this is an image of me and a friend of mine doing this research. This was for my master's thesis, which I'm not talking about right now, but my advisor's been doing research with economic games in this community for a long time. And originally it started because it was a part of a much larger research effort that included data from experimental economic games in 15 small-scale societies across the globe. Experimental economic games, what is that, right? So it's a method for collecting data concerning how participants have these social preferences in regards to another's well-being, or their social preferences regarding altruism, spitefulness, and reciprocity. So there's several components to a game. There's players and strategies and the payoffs, which in the Prisoner's Dilemma is a sort of game, actually. So when you're playing these games, you give a participant some allocation of money, and then there's certain rules and constraints about the game, and then they have to make a decision regarding some allocation of that money. So that's just generally what they're doing. So a specific game would be the ultimatum game. In the ultimatum game, there's two players. Player one receives a cash endowment and has to decide to give whatever amount that they choose to a second player. So that can be like none of it, all of it, anything in between. Player two can either accept the offer, where both players will receive the proposed division of funds, Or player 2 can reject the offer, wherein both players receive nothing. Okay. So from the data produced from these games, one of the points was that people are more generous than is predicted by the logic of rational self-interest. So for instance, so if you're asking like what would self-interest, like how would that be conveyed in the game? So in the ultimatum game, if you're player 1 and you're given all the money and you're making this decision, and you know the second player has the ability to reject or accept it, the rational self-interested decision is to give them the lowest amount possible. So you're losing the lowest amount, and then that way they're gaining the littlest amount, so they won't reject you. Because if they reject anything, then they're losing it an amount that's not rationally self-interested. And then that's one of the second major conclusions was that there is distinct cultural differences reflected in these preferences and strategies in all these different societies. So Patton has a chapter in this book, but he does not agree with the overall conclusion of the books, and I'm going to sort of go into why that's the case. Oh yeah, and this man right here, this is kind of how an ultimatum game is set up, just a piece of tape on the table. You put all the money you give player 1 on their side, to indicate that it's theirs, and then they can kind of slide over however many coins or however much money they want to offer to that second player. Okay. So the argument is that it's really coalitional stability and not just some abstract cultural norms that are really affecting cooperation in these games. So if you look on this y-axis, you have weaker to stronger average alliance strengths, and then these data points are color-coded for which political group they're from. So you see all the Quichua are very low on average alliance strength, and they're also very low on the percentage of the percent they offered out of the total they could have offered, and conversely the Achuar have convey a higher average alliance strength and greater offers. Okay. So this coalitional difference in these offers in this ultimatum game are actually echoed by data in coalitional differences and meat sharing also. So if you look here on the left, Quichua men, on their x-axis you have their status, and on the left you have households given to. So yeah, I'll explain that. It's just you show them these pictures again, and you just ask them, have you ever given this man meat, and you just put them into a yes or no pile. And so you just make a matrix of zeros and ones of not given meat, have given meat. So that's how that's collected. So you can see there's no real association at all between the Quichua men's status and how many households they're giving to, but that's not the case with the Achuar. Achuar men have greater average alliance strengths intra-coalitionally, so that's with other Achuar individuals, which is one of those preconditions for being rewarded with status. Because you only want to award status to someone you know is going to benefit you back in the future by being an ally. And that's logical given the greater likelihood of being supported in future conflicts. So the conclusions of some of this research would be that these coalitional differences in ultimatum game offers and in meat sharing is not easily explainable as an inherent cultural difference and norms of generosity between the Achuar and Quichua. Greater coalitional strength and stability could be altering the costs and benefits of how Achuar men are investing in meat sharing as a tactic to manage political risk and establish political loyalties. So if just think of it as a thought experiment, if you don't have coalitional stability, does it really make sense to invest in this meat sharing in the same way if you're not really faithful or confident that you're going to recoup the costs in the future? So that did have some meat and food sharing involved with this, but this is like a wholly cooperation and food sharing section. Okay, so yeah, there's some meat they're cutting up. So why and how would evolution produce a behavior that incurs an individual cost, as an effort and risk in hunting, which, I mean, I think is pretty risky. They do it all the time, but there's tons of snakes out in the jungle, so people get bit and die of snakes. It's not unheard of. In order to provide a collective benefit to individuals who didn't contribute time or effort in acquisition of these game resources. So that's that same dilemma of cooperation, but seen in food sharing. What's interesting is that unlike in other small-scale societies, in Kanambo, hunters have control over the distribution of their personally harvested game resources. So you see some differences between the data and how people are benefiting from meat sharing in Kanambo than in other societies like the Kung or Hadza from Africa. But this research specifically collected data to test many hypotheses stemming from these theories of cooperation. So that would be like kin selection and reciprocity, which I went over briefly. One for coalitional support, so that's you're sharing meat to garner and establish and maintain political coalitional support. And then this costly signaling and show-off theory and hypotheses. These are pretty related, but it's that hunters can pay this big cost to going out and hunting because it exhibits like their skill, these valuable skills and attributes to others, and that makes them valuable people for other people to want to interact with, and that leads to them having greater like reproductive success or access to mating opportunities. And then there's tolerated theft, so that's like if meat is transferred to avoid the cost of hoarding the resource away from others who are hungry. So say if you killed a very large animal and you ate all you can eat and you're really full, it's not worth as much to you as it is to people who haven't probably eaten, a good meal of meat in like half a week or a week or so. They're willing to pay a lot more for it. And I think it's, if I go back to this slide, I think actually we we tolerated theft from this fish that these guys had. They were walking down the airstrip. Earlier we gave them like all this fishing line and hooks and tackle and things. And so we were like where we were staying in our hut and we saw them walk by with this big fish. They saw us see them and we knew we gave them the fishing line. And so they like begrudgingly came over and chopped us up some fish. So sort of like one instance of that I kind of experienced. Okay, so data for understanding meat sharing. So this is another pile sort method. So I did mention this, where you can construct a meat sharing matrix where every dyadic relationship between individuals is coded either as a 1 or 0 to indicate a sharing or non-sharing relationship between those individuals. And then I'm going to go into data analysis concerning all of these different theories and hypotheses. So for kin selection, the data indicate that kinship is an important determinant of adaptive motivation for the transfer of meat between households in Kanambo. Meat was more likely to be transferred to the households of relatives more than more distant relatives or non-kin. The hunter's genetic relatedness with the heads of receiving households accounted for 11.3% of the variation in meat transfers. Continuing on, reciprocity, there's a significant positive relationship between meat giving and receiving, suggesting that there's this reciprocity for in-kind currency being meat, and hunters were more likely to give meat to households from which they received meat. Likewise, hunters gave more meat to households that gave more meat to them, So reciprocity in kind accounted for 32% of the variation in meat transfers between these households. And then going on to coalitional support, men who share more meat with each other are considered to be more likely to support each other in a conflict within Kanambo. There was a highly significant relationship between meat transfers and alliance strength between male heads of households, accounting for 22.4% of variation. Additionally, there's a significant but less predictive relationship between meat transfers and alliance strength between female heads of households. And then moving on to costly signaling. So there's no direct relationship between hunting skill and the number of children that a man fathered. When reproductive success is controlled by age, the correlation with hunting ability improved slightly but remained insignificant. And then moving to showing off. In Kanambo, better hunters are given higher status than less skilled hunters are of the same age, supporting show-off explanations for meat sharing. There's no direct correlation between a man's perceived hunting ability and his overall status. However, status is highly correlated with age, while hunting ability is not. And this relationship between hunting ability and age-corrected status was highly significant. So lastly, concerning tolerated theft, as predicted by the tolerated theft model, there's a highly significant relationship between meat transfers and linear spatial distance between houses. Households that were geographically closer to each other shared more meat. So like, what does all this mean? It seemed like everything's explaining a little bit of it, which is exactly the conclusion. So in Kanambo, transfers of meat are best explained by multiple adaptive strategies, many of which are better understood with reference to the political context of Kanambo. People's decisions about transferring meat to other households may be seen as consequential aspects of men's political strategies and the environmental and coalitional context in which they're embedded. So that concludes sort of everything I'm going to talk about. But there's some people I want to thank, because I went to the field site this summer and I did my own research. But so there's my advisor on the left, Dr. John Patton, our really excellent research assistant from Kanambo, Damaris Santi. She's really helpful with speaking Spanish and Achuar and Quechua and helping us get everything we needed to done. And then my good friend Mateo Peña Aguirre, I met him at a conference in Missouri, and he was like, oh, I'm Ecuadorian, I'm from Quito, so he literally jumped on a plane and flew out and just helped us out, which we wouldn't have been able to get it done without him. Some outside collaborators, and then a bunch of support and comments I received in informal research groups and classes in the semester. And then just kind of show the references, right? And then I'm open for any questions.
I had a question. One of the groups, was it the Achuar that had the higher, stronger alliance mechanisms? Is that because of the, it mentioned something about political context for one of the others. Is this because there's more of a threat to this society and having tighter bonds and alliance would be, people be motivated to exchange and strengthen bonds because of outside threats? Or what explains, in your point of view, the difference there? Was there any built-in state? I mean, these are fairly egalitarian societies, I take it, or not?
It is. So I would definitely think outside influences would be important. So in the data I showed you, you're correct that the Achuar had like stronger coalitional alliances. There's other data that I've seen where that's not always the case. So this changes over time. So I think when my advisor was first there doing this, he found that the Achuar were the stronger, more stable coalition with the stronger alliances. After that, it started to switch over to the Quechua being the more stronger and stable coalition. And then he's been working there so long that now when we were back there again, it's sort of reverting back to the Achuar kind of regaining eminence and coalitional strength. So I'm trying to think like what outside influences could be supporting that, because now people have easier access to flying out of the community and going to like some of the regional cities in their state. So maybe being more concerned with the events and alliances you have like with even an outside community, people moving, more likely to be acculturated and move out. Maybe the Achuar are more insulated from that outside influence, and that's why they can keep stronger coalitional alliances. maybe something like that.
It made me think a little bit of after Chagnon studied the Yanomamo and published the Yanomamo, the fierce people, and then later other people went in to study the Yanomamo in different areas and didn't find the degree of intervillage warfare and fierceness there.
Right.
Because it related to less competition for resources, etc. So you can have these variations within a culture and over time, as you suggest, for a variety of reasons.
I believe it was like the groups more closer into the Brazilian side for the Yanomamo, right? Like they're up in the highlands and they're a lot less warring and aggressive with each other. So there's always a role for environmental context, and it's, actually a mistake if you're not accounting for that.
In your research, do you deal at all with the issue of group selection, as David Sloan Wilson discusses it? I know that's a controversial topic.
Yeah.
If you have one society that's better at alliance building, other things being equal, this could affect the relative success between the groups. I'm just trying to get you going.
Right. Well, I'll tell you that my advisor and I are sort of unabashed anti-group selectionists.
Not surprised.
Yeah. So, yeah, like when I mentioned like some of that economic game research earlier, that Heinrich citation out of that book, like that's a cultural group selection argument.
I see.
So it's interesting that Patton has like the first chapter with data from one of these societies, and he completely says, oh, we don't agree with this. It's more of like this coalitional stability, political context that's instigating these differences in cooperative behavior in the game. And so I think that connects back with alliance relationships, because you're more likely, you're more confident in thinking that you'll receive support in the future, so you give more status to those who are greater warriors. So I think it still leads to group beneficial outcomes, but the individuals who are driving that are still being rewarded with all that status.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.